Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The blacksmith and the winter without coal. There was a winter as old as the rust that gathers on forgotten gates when snow fell upon the village without pause, covering the chimneys as if to silence even the bells of the small church. It was in that season that I met Thomas, the blacksmith, a man with rough hands and a low voice, who used to warm the world with the rhythmic sound of his hammer. But that year, the forge lay cold. The coal, scarce as bread in times of famine, had not arrived with the caravans stuck beyond the hills. And so, night after night, Thomas sat before the extinguished furnace, hearing only the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. The entire village seemed to breathe slowly, like one afraid to waste the little heat that remained. I remember seeing him leave in the morning, his beard covered in ice and his gaze fixed on the empty road, bargaining with neighbors over what little they had to give. A handful of old wood here, a promise to shoe a horse there. There was no pride in that silent trade, only the certainty that in winter, survival was never a solitary feat. And even with empty hands, Thomas had something no one could measure, a patience as hard as iron, forged by cold, and the stubborn hope that no ember, however small, is lost forever. At night, when the village sank into deep silence, Thomas stayed by the cold forge as one watches over a beloved sick person. He ran his fingers over the cold anvil, not to work, but to remember who he was and what those tools had once been capable of creating. His wife, Martha, would bring him a bowl of thin soup and a piece of hard bread, and there they would sit side by side, sharing not just the meal, but the scarce warmth of a blanket and the faith that winter does not last forever. Sometimes the children fell asleep, listening to old stories told in a low voice, almost as if they feared waking the cold. It was on one of those nights that something changed. A neighbor knocked at the door, Edmund, the miller, bringing not coal but a bundle of dry branches tied with rope. "It's not much," he said, ashamed, "but maybe it will heat the forge for an hour." Thomas accepted the gift with a small but sincere smile, and in that hour of weak embers, he shaped not a horseshoe nor a sword, but a simple nail, as if rekindling a promise. When the spark lit up his face, it was not only the iron that shone, it was proof that even the smallest flame has the strength to challenge darkness. The next morning, others came. First was old Agnes, with a basket of kindling, asking only that Thomas fix the latch on her door when he could. Then the shepherd brought a sack of peat, left over from autumn, he swore, though everyone knew there was nothing left that winter. Each visit left something small, almost insignificant, but little by little the forge began to breathe again, with a timid breath of heat and the familiar smell of warmed iron. And as the flames grew, so did a murmur of hope that spread through the village's stone houses. Thomas worked slowly, not just to save fuel, but to savor every hammer blow as if it were a hymn against the cold. At dusk, children gathered near the workshop door, fascinated by the orange glow escaping through the cracks. And even the hardest men, passing by the path, stopped for a moment to warm their hands before that humble ember as if it were a small private sun, kept just for them. In that coalless winter, Thomas was forging not just iron, he was forging a silent miracle, hammered in a slow cadence between hope and need. As days passed, the forge ceased to be Thomas's domain alone and became the heart of the village. There, neighbors gathered not only to warm their hands, but to exchange stories, share bread, and find small solutions for great hardships. The cold outside remained relentless, but before that lit furnace, people remembered that no storm lasts so long when faced in company. Even the quietest found words, as if the heat freed not only stiffened fingers, but also the forgotten voice of each one. Martha, with her serene manner, began preparing simple herbal infusions for those arriving shivering, and soon the scent of mint and honey mingled with that of embers and iron. The children laughed, running around the workshop, and sometimes Thomas paused just to watch them, a shy smile hidden beneath his beard. Perhaps there would still be days without enough coal, but there was something stronger than any smoking chimney, the certainty that, amid the cruelest winter, the village had found a refuge that did not go out. When the first snows began to give way, revealing the dark earth beneath the ice, the village had already changed. Thomas's forge was no longer just a workplace. It was a shelter where all had learned that warmth does not come only from fire, but also from hands reaching out to one another. Edmund, the miller, began to visit even without bringing wood, just to talk. Agnes, the old widow, always left a handful of fresh bread on the bench, and even the shepherd, who once barely took off his hat, sat by the fire, murmuring prayers that sounded more like gratitude than requests. That year, no one forgot the winter without coal, but no one forgot the nights when the lit forge illuminated more than the stone walls. It illuminated the simplest and deepest part of each of them. Thomas, standing before the anvil, looked at the living ember, and for a moment swore he heard in it a soft whisper, like a thank you from winter itself, that even in its cruelty, it had left that village a gift, the memory that true warmth is born when many hearts decide not to let a single one go out. And so when spring finally arrived, Thomas's forge remained lit, not only by the coal that had now returned to fill its barrels, but by the warmth that no longer depended on fire. Sometimes at night he stayed alone before the embers, listening to the soft crackle and feeling the light weight of gratitude, not only his own, but that of the whole village, etched in the air like a silent song. They say that in the winters that followed, no one feared the snow with the same anguish, because whenever the cold began to bite, they remembered that coalless year and the man who turned ashes into hope. And beneath the roof of every house a new fire burned, not made only of wood or coal, but of small, simple, persistent gestures capable of warming even the coldest days. The miller who lived on debts. I remember a harsh winter when the wheels of the old mill nearly stopped turning. The wind that once carried the sweet smell of flour now blew only cold and silence. I still see the figure of Martin, the miller, bent over the millstone as if trying to coax a miracle from stone. His apron bore the dust of hard days, and his tired eyes weighed heavier than the sacks of wheat that no longer arrived. The harvests had failed. The fields, once full of voices and hoes, lay bare and silent. The peasants came to the mill only to ask for time, and Martin, with the manner of a man who knew the harshness of the wind better than that of his own heart, accepted. He knew none of them had coins to pay. Still, he ground the grain, sometimes for a handful of eggs, sometimes just for a thank you, spoken with downcast eyes and trembling hands. As the days stretched on under the weight of debts and endless winters, the mill became more of a refuge than a business. Martin kept the stones turning, not to get rich, but to keep silence from taking the place of the grinding noise. He said that a stopped mill brought bad luck, and perhaps it was just superstition, or maybe it was the way he found to keep hope turning along with those old wheels. The collectors came from time to time with their scrolls full of seals and threats. Martin, hat worn in hand, received them with the humility of one who knew his own disadvantage. He paid what he could, a sack of flour here, a favor there, and when nothing was left, he simply promised. Strangely, no one dared take him away, perhaps because everyone knew that if the mill fell, the heart of that village would fall too. At night, when the wind whistled through the roof cracks, Martin sat before the millstone as if watching over an old friend. I remember seeing him once feeding the fire with almost paternal care while murmuring stories to the stone walls. They weren't prayers or complaints, just words spoken so that the echo wouldn't let him feel alone. and it was in that echo that neighbors sometimes arrived. A farmer with a small measure of rye forgotten in the back of the barn, a widow bringing a piece of hard cheese as symbolic payment. Martin accepted everything. Grain by grain, he ground it as if each handful was an act of resistance against winter and debt. He never asked when he would be paid. For him, the greatest debt was letting someone go home without flour. Some said Martin was digging his own ruin. The practical ones mocked him, saying a mill couldn't turn on favors and promises alone. But for those who knew him well, it was not weakness. It was stubbornness. A kind of silent faith that if he helped everyone, maybe when his turn came to fall, someone would help him rise as well. And somehow, that faith began to transform the mill. The village children ran there to borrow a handful of flour, returning laughing with faces white as if wearing party masks. The women, while waiting for their grain to be ground, brought warm bread to share. Even the toughest men, seeing Martin bent over the millstone, left small coins hidden on the doorstep. It was as if everyone understood that that old mill, sustained by debts and favors, was not just Martin's, but ours all. Over time, even the collectors began to change their tone. They still came with their scrolls and seals, but now accepted not only coins. They took sacks of flour, barrels of barley, or even a bit of patience. Perhaps they realized that no one could take Martin's mill without taking, along with it, the life of the entire village. And so, between threats never carried out and promises barely written, Martin went on. One night, I remember seeing him standing at the mill door, the moon reflecting on the river like liquid silver. He rested his calloused hands on the worn wood and sighed. A long sigh, but not of exhaustion. It was the sound of someone who had accepted that not all debts are paid in coins. Some are paid in warm bread, neighbors who keep the fire burning, and the simple turning of the millstones, like a heart that insists on beating even when the world seems to want to silence it. When spring finally came, bringing with it the damp smell of earth and the first green fields, the mill seemed to breathe again. The sacks of wheat began to reappear, timid at first, but soon piled beside the door. Martin smiled little. He was never a man of big laughs. But in that time his eyes shone with something deeper, the silent relief of one who survived an entire winter of debts and favors paid in trust. And that same season, something curious happened. Many who had received his help returned not only to pay what they owed, but to bring more. A handful of extra grains, a barrel of barley, even a new wheel to replace the old one that had creaked for years. Not because Martin demanded it, he never would, but because no one wanted the mill to fall silent again. It was as if each of us wanted to ensure that wheel never stopped turning. As days passed, the mill ceased to be just a workplace and became a meeting point. Men came not only to grind wheat, but to exchange stories. Women brought baskets of still warm bread, and children laughed while playing near the water wheel. Martin watched everything silently, hands resting on the handle of the shovel, and though he didn't say a word, there was a quiet pride on his face, as if somehow that small miracle had been worth every night of worry. And so, the debts that once weighed on his shoulders turned into something else, an invisible web of gratitude. Martin never became rich, nor did he need to. His payment came in the constant sound of the millstones, in the smell of fresh flour that filled the air, and in the certainty that as long as his mill turned, no one in the village would return home empty-handed. In the end, he not only kept the mill standing, he kept alive the hope of all of us. With summer, the mill seemed almost to sing. The river ran fuller, and the wheels turned effortlessly, as if they too remembered the cold and silent nights. Martin, sitting on the doorstep, watched the village's movement with rare calm. There was no hurry, no fear, just the sound of wooden paddles dipping into the water, rhythmic as an old clock that never misses the hour. And on quiet nights, When everyone returned home with bread in their baskets and flour on their aprons, I still saw Martin putting out the mill's lanterns, one by one. Before closing the door, he touched the millstone with an open palm, as if thanking an old friend. And maybe that was exactly what it was. Not a man trapped by debts, but someone who, with stubbornness and kindness, had transformed every favor, every small gesture, into something no demand could erase. The priest who buried the forgotten. I remember the old priest well. He had no title or prestige, only a worn cloak that smelled of candle smoke and damp earth. The village, marked by the scars of the plague, lived immersed in a silence broken only by the wind dragging dry leaves between the wooden houses. It was he who walked every morning to the field of the dead, with a shovel resting on his shoulder and a calm, almost resigned determination, as if each step were just another prayer. There were no processions, no chants, just the earth, the makeshift crosses, and the simple faith of a man who, faced with so much absence, insisted on remaining. They said he never cried, perhaps because his tears had run dry years before, or perhaps because, unlike all of us, he found comfort in his own routine. When the plague took entire families, he was the one who knelt by the shallow graves, murmuring names no one else remembered. And yet, there was something profoundly serene about that solitary figure. Between one burial and another, he placed small stones around the crosses, as if wanting to prevent forgetfulness from taking away what remained of each life. And somehow, in that landscape of loss, that simple gesture made the world seem a little less empty. Sometimes I saw him sitting beside the graves, even when there were no new bodies to bury. He stayed there in silence, looking at the horizon where the sun set behind the hills. He did not pray aloud, nor ask anything from the heavens. He just remained, as if keeping company with the dead, so they would not feel so alone. It was strange, but comforting, as if in that patch of land where life ended, there was still room for tenderness. One afternoon I brought him some bread and broth, and he just smiled, thanking me with a discreet nod. We sat side by side, without many words. The wind swayed the wooden crosses as if each one were alive, responding to the priest's presence. It was then that he told me, almost in a whisper, "Faith is not up there. It's here, in those who remain." And I, not knowing how to reply, just looked at those lined graves and realized that indeed there was something sacred in that silent care. Over time, I learned to recognize the rhythm of the old priest's days. In the morning, he walked among the empty houses, collecting firewood left behind and lighting candles on the windowsills where no one lived anymore. It was not a church ritual, but a simple gesture to remind the living that they were not alone. And somehow, each flame seemed to warm not only the cold walls, but also the weary hearts of the village. At night, when the silence deepened and the wind carried the distant smell of bonfires, he sat before the small chapel and tuned his voice to a nearly imperceptible chant. It was not a known hymn, just a low, broken melody that sounded more like a conversation with those who had already departed. And yet there was peace in that sound, as if even death, for a brief moment, leaned in to listen. There were days when I accompanied him to the field of the dead. The ground was always damp, and shoes sank slightly into the soft earth. He, however, walked unhurriedly, as if he knew every stone, every curve of the terrain. When we reached the makeshift crosses, he ran his hand over the rough boards, as if greeting old friends. "They have not been forgotten," he said, and somehow I believed him. Once I asked him why he did all this when no one else seemed to care. He looked at me with those tired but calm eyes and replied, "Because someone has to remember. And as long as someone remembers, they still live a little." His words were etched in me like a prayer without an altar, stronger than any sermon I'd ever heard. And since then, I began to see each cross not as an end, but as a silent point of hope. In winter, When the snow covered the field like a white, silent cloak, he still went there, with the same calm as always. The cold wind cut his face, but the priest never complained. He just adjusted his hood and brushed the snow off the crosses, one by one, with his own hands. "They can't feel cold," he murmured, as if his dedication could warm even those sleeping beneath the earth, and somehow, looking at him, I almost believed he could. As the months passed, I noticed that the village, though marked by plague and mourning, seemed to breathe a little lighter whenever the priest was around. Not because he drove away the pain, but because he faced it with a serenity that spread like slow fire in an old fireplace. The orphaned children silently followed him, and the few adults left found comfort simply in seeing him walk among us, firm, steady, like a bell that never stopped ringing. One night, when the moon was high and the wind whispered among the empty houses, I saw the priest sitting alone before the chapel. He held a small wooden crucifix, but did not look at it. He looked at the stars. I sat beside him without saying a word, and for long minutes we only heard the distant creaking of branches. Then, in a low, calm voice, he said, "It's not heaven that consoles. It's those who stay by our side." And in that moment, I understood that the faith of that man was not made of miracles, but of silent presences. After that, I began helping him with his tasks. Together we cleaned the crosses, lit candles, and replaced the stones the wind carried away. There was no rush, no sadness, just a quiet care, like someone patiently sewing a torn fabric. And while we worked side by side, I noticed something I had never seen before. Even among the dead, he lived surrounded by life. Over time, other villagers began to approach. At first shy, only leaving small wildflowers at the foot of the crosses. Later, some started bringing bread, water, and even candles, so the priest wouldn't do it all alone. There were no speeches or invitations, just a silent understanding that that field, once feared, had become a meeting place. Between the sound of shovels in the earth and the rustling of the wind, a strange kind of hope was born, and the old priest, always serene, just smiled at these small changes. He never said thank you, because he seemed to believe that none of it was for him. Instead, he made the sign of the cross and murmured something almost inaudible, as if blessing each gesture. I saw a discreet sparkle in his eyes, not of victory, but of comfort. He had transformed loneliness into company, mourning into care, and somehow death into a less cold place. There was one especially cold morning when the priest placed a new cross, made from wood from an abandoned door. He stuck it into the ground with his own hands, then rested a moment leaning on it, as if holding not only the weight of the wood, but also that of all the memories kept there. "Each cross is a promise," he said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular. "A promise that they will not be forgotten." And in those words, even the wind seemed to fall silent. That same night, I returned alone to the field. The candles the priest had lit still flickered, protected in small clay pots, and the place seemed less gloomy. Between the long shadows and the freshly fallen snow, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not the grand peace of altars and cathedrals, but a simple peace, like a song only the living can sing. And for the first time since the plague, I realized that the silence of that village was not just emptiness, it was also rest. As the weeks went by, that peace began to spread. The children, once fearful of passing through the field of the dead, now walked there without fear, leaving small stones or arranged twigs, as if they too wanted to be part of that silent care. And the priest, with a brief smile, just nodded, as one who knows that faith is not preached in sermons, but planted in gestures. Once, seeing him light another candle under the snow, I asked if he ever got tired. He answered simply, "Tiredness exists, but compassion is more stubborn." At that moment, I understood that there was something sacred, not only in the murmured prayers, but in the persistence of this man who, even faced with loss, insisted on offering warmth to those who could no longer feel it. And somehow, that warmed us too. When spring finally arrived, the field of the dead changed its face. Among the crosses, small wildflowers began to appear, shy at first, but soon filling the spaces as if the earth itself wanted to give thanks. The priest, with his hands marked by cold and work, did not uproot any of them. He only arranged them carefully, as if they were part of his silent parish. "They deserve a little beauty," he murmured. And in that moment, even the little birds seemed to listen. It was then I realized it was not just a place of burials. It was a memory garden, cultivated by a man who never gave up believing in the living. The children ran among the flowers, the villagers left bread and candles, and for a brief moment, the whole village seemed to breathe again. The priest did not need miracles, only perseverance, and a heart that knew how to turn mourning into comfort. Over time, many began to say that that field was no longer a place of fear, but of rest. When someone departed, it was known that the old priest would be there, with his steady hands and calm voice, ensuring that no one would be cast into oblivion. And that certainty, simple as it was, brought back a kind of courage to the village, the courage to keep living, even amid so many losses. One golden afternoon, I saw the priest sitting before the crosses, watching the sunset as one contemplates an altar. The wind stirred his worn cassock, and for a moment it seemed that even the earth itself breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was enough. And in that silence I discovered that sometimes faith is not in distant heavens, but in the humble care of those who remain. The farmer and the salt debt. I clearly remember that pale winter, when the wind seemed to whisper through the empty fields and the distant sound of the village bell echoed like a reminder of debts and hopes. The farmer's name was Aldegunda, a woman with calloused hands and a steady gaze, whose strength came not only from the land she cultivated, but from the stubborn silence of someone who had learned to resist. She was a widow, and her house, with walls of clay and a thatched roof, stood by the riverbank, where willows leaned like old counsellors. That year, however, the tax collection came harsher than ever. Salt, a tribute so high that not all the tears of the sea could pay for it. I remember seeing her in the market square with a worn apron and an empty basket in her arms, surrounded by the murmurs of neighbours. Some offered advice that felt more like reproach, others only poorly hidden looks of pity. The collector, a thin man with a grey beard, waved his ledger like someone holding an inevitable verdict. "Pay up or lose the land," he said, and each word sounded like a hammer blow on stone. But Aldegunda did not tremble. She simply straightened her shoulders, as if challenging the very wind, and declared she would find a way, even if she had to sell more than she owned, or exchange promises for sacks of salt. The market that morning was full of mixed smells. Salted fish from the barrels, freshly baked bread from the stalls, and the strong aroma of herbs hanging in bundles at the healers' tents. Aldegunda walked among the merchants with firm steps, her head held high, although her heart beat heavy. Each sack of salt seemed farther than the horizon. Still, she did not beg. She preferred to offer something in exchange: wheat, milk, small promises of work. Some laughed, others shook their heads, as if her courage was just another village fool's folly. Then I found her before the stall of a merchant with small eyes and fat hands, known for nearly impossible bargains. 3 measures of wheat for a handful of salt? Not even if the sky falls, he shouted, laughing loudly. But Aldegunda did not back down. With the calm of someone planting seeds, knowing they will only sprout months later, she replied, "Then wait. If the sky falls, it will bring rain, and I will give you more wheat than you can count." Some listening laughed softly, others just frowned, but I saw something rare there: a woman willing to fight with nothing but her voice and dignity. As the day advanced, the square buzzed with voices like a river after a flood. Aldegunda, however, moved with the serenity of one who learned to measure each step, as if the noise around her did not touch her. I saw her exchange small tasks for copper coins, repairing a broken loom, spinning some wool, carrying water for an old neighbor barely able to hold the bucket. They were not great feats, but each earned her a thread of hope, and little by little small handfuls of salt accumulated in her worn apron. It was at dusk that something curious happened. An old fisherman with a thick beard and hunched back approached her with a half-empty sack. "I have no coins to pay for the firewood you lent me last winter," he said, "but I have salt, and that must be worth something." Aldegunda smiled, not with triumph, but with silent gratitude, as if receiving a gift greater than it seemed. And at that moment, among barrels of fish and children's laughter, I realized that debt was not just hers. It was a struggle the entire village, in some way, had begun to carry together. That night, when the sky turned violet and the first stars appeared, Aldegunda returned home with slow but firm steps. Her apron held only a handful of salt, still far from paying the demanded amount. Even so, she seemed lighter, as if each small victory was another brick to build a bridge over the abyss, separating her from the seizure. She sat on her doorstep, lit a small lamp, and for a moment just listened to the murmuring river and the rustling willows. As she watched the flickering flame, she heard footsteps approaching. It was Marta, the village midwife, carrying a small cloth bundle. "I don't have much," she said, "but you've helped me so many times. It would be unfair not to try to help now." Inside the bundle, salt. Little, but enough to make Aldegunda bring her hands to her face and hold back a laugh mixed with tears. At that moment, I realized that the village, so divided between compassion and envy, was beginning, timidly, to lean towards solidarity. In the following days, Aldegunda's story ran like wind through the narrow alleys and frozen fields. Some said it was madness, that she would never pay everything only with favors and small gestures. Others, however, began to see her as an example of serene stubbornness. Soon more neighbors came forward. A young shepherd brought salt in exchange for bread. A widow offered a handful she had saved since the last market. Even children with tiny hands came to give her white pebbles they had gathered near the river, as if they could somehow help save her land. And so, little by little, the salt debt began to lose the weight that once seemed overwhelming. Not that it was easy. There were nights when Aldegunda cried alone, fearing it wouldn't be enough. Nights when the moon peeked through her window like a silent witness to her struggle. But each morning brought something new, an unexpected gesture, a modest offer, or simply the strength to get up and keep going. And in that persistence there was an almost sacred beauty, as if the very earth, witness to so many harvests, was leaning in to protect her. Then came the day of the official collection. The square was full, and the collector, with his ledger under his arm, seemed eager to see the outcome. Aldegunda approached with her apron loaded with small sacks, each the fruit of days of effort and generous hands. The village's eyes followed every step, some doubtful, others curious, and many with a discreet sparkle of hope. When the salt was poured before the collector, the sound of the small stones hitting the wood echoed like a silent thunder. He counted once, twice, 3 times, until there was no doubt the debt was paid. Nothing remained but the echo of murmurs through the square. Aldegunda, however, did not smile triumphantly. She simply breathed deeply and gave thanks, not only to the collector, but to every neighbor who, one way or another, had placed a handful of trust in her. And at that moment, amidst the smell of fresh bread from the stalls and the gentle cold of the morning, all could see something rare, the quiet victory of one who wins without crushing anyone. After that day, something changed in the village. It was no longer just the story of a debt paid in salt, but of how a handful of joined hands could lift someone from the ground. Doors, once closed, began to open more easily. Neighbors, once silent, began greeting each other with longer nods. And Aldegunda, with her land preserved, returned to the fields with the same serenity as always, tilling the soil as one who returns gratitude to the world. I remember seeing her, weeks later by the river, washing her hands in the cold water, while the wind played with the willows. The sun gilded her work-marked skin, and she seemed to carry within herself a peace that came not only from victory, but from the certainty of having remained where she belonged. And in that simple, almost sacred vision, I understood that wealth is not always in salt, coins, or land, but in the quiet dignity of a life well lived. The scribe's apprentice and the stolen scroll. I clearly remember the nights in the old monastery's scriptorium when the stone walls held the cold like an ancient secret, and only the smell of ink and parchment seemed to keep me awake. I was just an apprentice, with fingers stained black and a mind anxious not to err. Every letter I traced seemed to carry the weight of an oath. And in those days, losing a single scroll was more than a mere mistake. It was a shadow capable of erasing an entire future. It was on one such night, while the rain drummed against the narrow windows and the monks worked silently, that misfortune revealed itself. A scroll had disappeared. Not just any scroll, but a rare manuscript the abbot guarded as if it contained the very voice of the heavens. Soon, all eyes turned to me, the youngest and least experienced. At that moment I felt the world shrink until it fit between the dry sound of a quill scraping leather and the pounding of my own heart. The silence that followed was heavier than any direct accusation. No one spoke, but the air seemed thick with restrained judgment. The abbot did not shout, nor did he need to. He simply laid his hand on the nearest scroll and said in a low, slow voice that even the smallest error could stain a soul forever. I felt my hands sweat beneath the coarse habit sleeves, yet I could not utter a single word, because deep down there was something worse than punishment, the shame of being seen as unworthy. That night, while the other monks put away their quills and closed their inkwells, I remained seated, staring at my empty desk. One of them, a copyist with a face marked by wrinkles and perpetually tired eyes, approached me. He said nothing, only placed a piece of hard bread before me and gave a look that was not reproachful but understanding. It was then that I learned the first lesson not found in any manuscript. Sometimes surviving in the monastery was not just about following rules, it was about learning to read the silences. I spent the early morning turning over every corner of the scriptorium. I rummaged through piles of scrolls, examined dust-covered shelves, and even looked under oak tables where candle wax left hardened stains like little fallen constellations. But nothing. The scrolls seemed to have evaporated, as if the monastery's cold walls had swallowed it. Every step echoed down the empty hallway, and the shadow of the columns seemed to watch me, reminding me that dawn would bring questions I had no answers for. When I finally gave up and sat beside the extinguished fireplace, I heard soft footsteps. It was the same copyist with tired eyes. He did not look at me directly, but dropped, with calculated carelessness, a small clue. Sometimes what disappears isn't lost, only hidden where no one dares to look. Then he walked away without another word. At that moment, I understood that surviving in the monastery required more than faith and discipline. One had to learn to decipher enigmas not written in ink, but in men's gestures. The next morning, as the bells called to prayer, I walked the narrow corridors, weighed down like a condemned man. The abbot watched me with that severe calm that could crush more than any shout, and the other monks averted their gaze as if fearing my disgrace was contagious. But among the lowered faces, I saw again that copyist with tired eyes. A slight nod, almost imperceptible, indicated the direction of the old library. a place only the most experienced monks dared to enter without permission. I waited until everyone was occupied with their chants, then silently walked to the heavy library door. The wood creaked as if complaining about my presence. Inside, the smell of ancient parchment was almost sweet, mixed with dust and the cold that seemed never to leave. I searched every table, every shelf, until in a forgotten corner I found a small oak box. Inside, folded with the care of one who knows the value of what is hidden, was the missing scroll. Not stolen, not lost, just protected, as if part of a lesson I still needed to learn. I held the scroll with trembling hands, feeling the weight not only of the leather, but of the responsibility it carried. There was no doubt someone had purposely placed it there. And for a brief moment, I felt no anger, only a strange relief, because if someone had hidden the manuscript, there was also someone hoping I could find it. I closed the box carefully, breathed deeply, and returned to the scriptorium with light steps, as if the very stone beneath my feet was guiding me. When I arrived, the abbot was already waiting. His eyes landed on me like silent blades, but he said nothing. I only watched as I placed the scroll on the central table, intact. Behind him, I saw the old copyist smile almost invisibly, as one witnessing a rite of passage. No one mentioned what had happened, and that morning we continued copying line after line as if nothing had occurred. But something inside me had changed forever. It was there, in that silence between letters and the sighs of candles, that I understood the monastery's true lesson. It is not just about obeying rules or avoiding mistakes, but about understanding the subtle gestures that keep life in balance. Learning to live among looks that say more than words, among unspoken favors and secrets whispered in the dark. Surviving in those times was not only following the light of faith, but also the shadow of prudence. As months passed, fear transformed into serene calm. My workmates stopped looking at me as a walking mistake and began accepting me as part of that strange living organism that was the monastery. And although the scroll was never explained, nor its disappearance justified, it remained a silent symbol of the fragility and strength that coexist in the human soul. A reminder for me, and for anyone willing to listen, that even in the harshest times, there was room for humanity. On nights when the full moon bathed the ancient stones with its pale light, I sat by the scriptorium window, watching the wind play among the courtyard trees' leaves. The scent of dry hay and melted wax mixed with the monastery's almost sacred silence. It was in these moments that I felt most clearly the presence of those who, like me, learned to navigate silences, favors, and small life-saving gestures. Sometimes I remember the fear I felt that dark night, but not as a burden, rather as a thin thread connecting me to something greater, an ancestral tradition of patience and silent wisdom. Life in the monastery was made of those invisible threads, carefully woven, forming a delicate and resilient web of humanity where even a lost scroll could teach the most valuable lessons. And so over time, I became not just a copyist of words, but a guardian of unwritten stories. Those that lived in a brother's glance, in the subtle touch of an outstretched hand, in the silent understanding among those sharing the same stone and faith roof. That stolen scroll, or perhaps just hidden, became a symbol of all that cannot be said aloud, but is understood in the heart. Today, when I close my eyes, I still feel the slight tremble of the candles and the smell of fresh ink, reminding me that survival in the Middle Ages was not made only of rigid rules or severe punishments, but of small moments of humanity woven amidst the harshness of fate. And with this sweet and calm memory, I wish that you, wherever you are, may find your own hidden scroll, that silent secret that guards your peace. The monastery's stones remain there, firm and silent, eternal witnesses of guarded secrets and lived stories. And even if time erases names and faces, the spirit of that place remains, whispering to anyone who will listen that in the darkness, There is always a faint light made of kind gestures and understanding looks. May that gentle light, like the flickering flame of a candle, barely lighting the night, accompany you now and always, bringing calm and comfort as sleep comes slowly, like an old friend. Good night, traveler of ancient memories. The Shepherd and the Invisible Wolves. I remember a small, isolated village nestled among tall pine forests that whispered secrets with the cold wind. It was a place where stone houses huddled under a grey sky, and the night breeze carried the pungent scent of freshly cut hay and wood burning lazily in the hearths. There lived a simple shepherd, known among the neighbours for his calm demeanour and the constant company of his flock. But that winter, something strange began to happen. Snow fell silently, covering the ground with a cold white blanket, and with it came the mysterious disappearance of some sheep that left the village uneasy, whispering behind closed doors and windows. The shepherd, a man with calloused hands and a serene gaze, felt the weight of the villagers' suspicious eyes. They said he had been negligent, perhaps lazy, even guilty of handing his sheep to the wolves, but he knew it was not so. On cold nights, around the gently crackling fire, he heard old stories about invisible wolves, shadows moving among the trees, almost like ghosts, taking the flock without leaving a trace. Doubt gnawed at the silence, and he found himself alone before the growing fear in the village's heart. Amid whispers and glances, he walked the narrow forest trails, feeling the damp earth beneath his boots and the smell of wet moss. His faithful dogs, thick-coated with bright eyes, followed closely, sniffing every fallen leaf. The tall trees held millennia-old secrets, and he knew that to protect his livelihood, he would need more than strength. He would need patience, courage, and a keen eye for the signs nature left him. So he waited between mist and silence, hoping the truth would find its way to the distrustful hearts of the village. On calm mornings, when the shy sun rose through the treetops, the shepherd visited every corner of the pasture, noting almost imperceptible footprints in the soft snow. They were too small for common wolves, as if light and elusive creatures had passed stealthily, leaving only doubt as witness. The village, however, paid little attention to his words. Fear and rumors spread like the biting wind, cutting through the poorly closed windows of the houses. As the days shortened and the cold tightened, he took refuge in the simplicity of daily routines, tending the remaining flock, mending worn clothes, and warming the fire with dry twigs. The solitude of the forest seemed sometimes to converse with him, whispering ancient secrets among the branches. And in that quietness, the shepherd discovered that it was not only about protecting the cattle, but also preserving dignity amid the doubt and heavy silence threatening to swallow his story. On nights when the full moon poured its silver light over the snowy fields, the shepherd sat on the doorstep, wrapped in a coarse shawl, letting the crackling of the fireplace lull his thoughts. There was something deeply melancholic in that moment. The feeling of being part of a world where truth hid among shadows, where men's eyes could close to innocence as easily as to fear. He remembered the old tales of the elders, speaking of wolves unseen, whispering in the trees and vanishing before dawn, leaving only a trail of uncertainty. Despite the suspicions around him, he kept a silent secret. Once, during a late vigil, he felt the presence of those invisible shadows, not with his eyes, but with his heart. A cold breeze, not coming from the wind, a whisper that did not belong to any visible being. Amid the forest's silence, he understood that not all absence could be explained by human logic. Sometimes the world held mysteries that were, after all, as real as the touch of the sun or the smell of wet earth. In the following days, the village seemed to hold its breath while the shepherd continued his silent vigil. Harsh words and suspicious looks slowly gave way to small gestures. A timid wave here, fresh bread discreetly left there. Among the villagers was a silent understanding that the man before them was not guilty, but rather a victim of the very shadows prowling their fields. The snow melted, and with it, part of the frozen fear in their hearts. On a clear morning, when the sun finally warmed the icy air, the shepherd found a sheep near a clearing, lost but safe, sheltered among dense bushes. It was not a miracle, but a simple, silent reminder that even in the hardest times, hope persisted. And so, surrounded by the scent of the damp forest and the distant sound of the stream, he felt a deep peace, the certainty that not all darkness can extinguish the light born of perseverance and serene faith. The shepherd returned to the village that afternoon, with less bowed shoulders and a subtle glow in his eyes. It was not the victory of those who shout, but of those who endure calmly. The stories that once carried suspicion began to soften into gentler conversations, with restrained laughter and shared memories by the fire. He knew that in that harsh winter, he had not only faced invisible wolves, but also the ghosts of judgment and human fear. As the seasons changed, snow gave way to spring, and the delicate green of leaves renewed the landscape around the village. The shepherd, now accepted again among his neighbors, continued caring for the flock with the same patience and affection. The experience had taught him that in the vastness of the natural and human world, not everything is explained with certainty, but serenity and perseverance are refuges for those who, even under the weight of silence, keep the flame of hope alive. On afternoons, when the sun warmed the damp ground, it was common to see him sitting in the shade of an ancient tree, watching the flock graze peacefully. The distant murmur of the village mixed with the soft song of birds, creating a symphony that calmed any unrest. He, with his calloused hands, stroked an older sheep as one would a long-time friend, and smiled with the serenity of someone who had learned to respect the rhythms of the earth and time. And amid this simple daily life, the shepherd felt deep gratitude for the village that welcomed him, for the silence that sometimes spoke louder than words, and for the lessons hidden among the winds of the forest. For in the end, understanding that not all wolves are visible, and that shadow can be a refuge rather than a threat, was what brought him peace. And so he went on, walking slowly through life, between ancient stories and the serene promise of each new dawn. Over the years, the shepherd became a calm and respected figure, known not for his faults, but for the patience with which he faced doubts and the biting cold of winter. He understood that life was made of cycles, shadows, and light, and that each step, even silent, left a deep mark on the invisible fabric that connects people and the land. And among the leaves dancing in the wind, he found comfort in the small things, the warmth of the sun on his face, the smell of wet grass, the distant sound of chapel bells. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, when stars shone brightly over the village, he still walked to the forest, not with fear, but with respect. He looked at the secret paths, the corners where snow still held traces of an ancient mystery, and felt part of that silent dance between the visible and the invisible. For he knew that not all absence is loss, nor every shadow a threat. Some are just gentle reminders of the mystery that dwells in every soul and every flock beneath the dark sky. And so, in that village surrounded by ancient forests, the story of the shepherd and the invisible wolves became a quiet murmur, lovingly told beside hearths on long winter nights. A gentle memory, speaking of human fragility, the silent strength of hope, and the delicate balance between fear and trust. It was a tale that, though shrouded in mystery, brought with it comforting peace, like the warm embrace of an old friend. When I close my eyes, I can still smell the hay, hear the whisper of the trees, and see the calm figure of that man who, even under the shadow of doubt, walked with dignity. And perhaps that is the lesson he left us, that in a world where the invisible and the inexplicable coexist, serenity and simple faith are the true guardians of our livelihood and our soul. Now, with a calm heart, I let this memory rest softly, like the snow that silently covers the village, protecting all that is fragile and beautiful.